It was a chilly October evening when Emma and her boyfriend Jason moved into the small ivy-covered apartment building in the outskirts of Boston. The street was quiet, almost too quiet, lined with maple trees whose leaves had already turned to fiery shades of orange and red. Emma had insisted on moving out of their cramped apartment downtown, claiming she needed a fresh start, a place where she could breathe and perhaps write her next novel. Jason, ever supportive, had agreed, secretly hoping that a change of scenery might rekindle the spark he felt was slowly dimming in their relationship. The apartment was old, built in the 1920s, with creaky wooden floors, narrow hallways, and high ceilings that gave it an eerie yet strangely charming aura. The real estate agent had boasted about the place's classic character, but Emma and Jason immediately noticed the strange chill that lingered in the corners of each room. It wasn't just the cold air, though. It was something else, something intangible that seemed to press against their skin, a silent weight that made the hairs on the back of Emma's neck stand on end. After hours of unpacking boxes, they finally sat on the faded green couch in the living room. Jason was exhausted, wiping sweat from his brow, while Emma moved a stray strand of hair from her face, glancing at the old, cracked mirror hanging on the wall opposite the couch. For reasons she couldn't explain, she felt a shiver run down her spine as she stared into her own reflection. "You okay?" Jason asked, noticing her pause. "Yeah, just a little tired, I guess," she said, forcing a smile. But as the words left her mouth, Emma felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She turned quickly, scanning the empty hallway that led to the bedrooms. But there was nothing, just the shadows of the evening stretching along the walls. They decided to make dinner to take their minds off the weird energy in the apartment. Jason chopped vegetables while Emma set the table. The sounds of their cooking, sizzling oil, the clatter of knives against the cutting board, filled the apartment, temporarily drowning out the strange silence that had settled over the space. But then, as they sat down to eat, Emma thought she heard a soft scratching sound, like fingernails dragging lightly against wood, coming from the hallway. "Did you hear that?" she asked, freezing mid-bite. Jason paused, listening. "Hear what?" Emma shook her head, trying to convince herself it was just the old building settling. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The scratching came again, faint, deliberate, almost human. As night fell, they retired to the bedroom. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the walls. She tried to read a book to calm her nerves, but her eyes kept darting toward the dark corners of the room. Jason fell asleep quickly, exhaustion finally catching up with him. But Emma lay awake, heart pounding, listening to the creaks and groans of the apartment. Around midnight, a whisper drifted through the room. At first, Emma thought she had imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. Her name, Emma. She bolted upright in bed, scanning the darkness. Jason stirred but remained asleep, oblivious to the faint voice that seemed to echo from the shadows near the door. Emma's breath quickened and she reached for her phone, intending to call him. But as she grabbed the device, the whisper returned, this time closer, almost in her ear. "Emma." Terrified, she flicked on the bedside lamp. The room was empty. No sign of anyone. No one in the apartment except them, or so she hoped. She shook her head, trying to convince herself it was her imagination. Stress from the move, the unfamiliar creaks of an old building playing tricks on her mind. But over the next few days, the incidents escalated. Objects moved on their own. Her laptop would open in the middle of the night, displaying blank documents, the cursor blinking, waiting. Doors she was sure she had locked were found ajar. And always, the whispering, soft, urgent, almost pleading. Jason noticed her unease but attributed it to her overactive imagination. "Old buildings are weird, Em. Maybe the pipes are making sounds," he said one evening as she recounted another strange encounter. But Emma wasn't convinced. She could feel the presence growing stronger, a shadow that followed her from room to room, lingering just at the edge of her vision. One rainy night, she was alone in the apartment, Jason having gone to a late-night work meeting. She curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, trying to watch a movie. The rain tapped rhythmically against the windows, a soothing soundtrack to mask the creeping dread in her chest. And then she saw it, a figure reflected in the window. Tall, thin, featureless, standing on the balcony outside, completely still. Emma froze, heart hammering. She blinked and the figure was gone. She ran to the balcony door, yanking it open. The balcony was empty, drenched from the rain. No footprints, no signs of life, only the faint echo of that whisper, Emma. Shaking, she closed the door and locked it, but the sense of being watched didn't leave. The apartment no longer felt like a home. It was a trap, and she was its prey. By the time Jason returned, Emma was pale, trembling. She tried to explain, but the words caught in her throat. He hugged her, brushing it off as anxiety. But that night, as they slept, Emma awoke to a cold hand on her shoulder. She jerked awake, gasping, but the bed was empty. The air around her seemed to thicken, pressing in with a malevolent intent, and from the darkness, the whisper came again, clearer than ever. Emma, I've been waiting for you. The following morning, Emma woke up to the pale sunlight filtering through the tattered curtains, yet the unease from the previous night lingered like a heavy fog. She rubbed her eyes, trying to convince herself it had been a dream, but the lingering chill in the room told her otherwise. Jason was still asleep beside her, breathing steadily, completely unaware of the invisible presence that had haunted her throughout the night. She rose quietly, careful not to wake him, and moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside. The street outside was empty, eerily silent, with mist curling around the base of the maple trees. Emma shivered, brushing away the memory of the shadowy figure she had seen on the balcony. She told herself that she had imagined it, or maybe the reflection of a street lamp had created the illusion. But deep down, she knew that this was no ordinary trick of the mind. Something in the apartment was watching. As she made her way to the kitchen, she noticed that the door to their bedroom, which she was sure she had locked last night, was slightly ajar. Her pulse quickened and she hesitated at the threshold. Jason had left the door open, or had someone or something been in the room? She stepped cautiously inside, scanning the area. Nothing, just the rumpled sheets and the faint scent of his cologne. Trying to shake off her fear, Emma prepared breakfast, but the strange occurrences of the past night gnawed at her. She remembered the whisper, soft and deliberate. Emma, I've been waiting for you. The words seemed to echo in her mind as she went about her morning routine. When Jason finally emerged from the bedroom, he noticed her pale complexion and tense posture. You look like you didn't sleep a wink, he said, concerned. I just had a weird night, she admitted, not wanting to mention the whispering. Who would believe her? He shrugged, attributing it to the stress of moving. You've got to relax. Why don't we go out for coffee? Clear our heads, Emma agreed, hoping that some sunlight and fresh air might dispel the oppressive feeling that clung to her like a second skin. As they walked through the quiet streets, Emma couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was trailing them. Every time she glanced behind her, the mist seemed to thicken, obscuring the view, hiding whatever it was that stalked her. Back at the apartment, the unease intensified. Objects began to shift subtly. A cup she had left on the counter appeared on the table. A book she had placed on the shelf fell to the floor, pages fluttering as if disturbed by an unseen hand. Emma's heart raced with each unexplained movement. She tried to convince herself it was merely the old building settling, but the deliberate nature of the disturbances suggested otherwise. That night, Jason was out at a late meeting. Emma curled up on the couch with a blanket, trying to distract herself with a novel, but her focus kept slipping back to the shadows that danced along the walls. Then she heard it, a faint, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the wooden floor. She froze, straining to hear. It came again, closer this time, moving slowly from the hallway toward the living room. Her breath caught in her throat. Emma reached for the baseball bat Jason had left in the corner for protection, gripping it tightly. The shadows seemed to twist unnaturally, stretching and coiling as if alive. Emma's eyes darted around the room, searching for the source, but there was nothing, until she saw a figure step out from the corner near the kitchen. It was tall, impossibly thin, its features obscured by darkness. She could feel its gaze, even without eyes, boring into her. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response, only silence, thick and suffocating. And then the whisper, unmistakable, close to her ear, "Emma." Emma swung the bat instinctively, but the figure had vanished. Her heart raced and sweat drenched her palms. She ran to the kitchen, checking every corner, every shadow, but the apartment was empty. Empty, yet filled with a presence that refused to leave. Over the next few nights, the occurrences became more sinister. Emma began finding notes written in an unfamiliar hand, cryptic messages scrawled on scraps of paper left in places she would never have looked. Inside the refrigerator, under her pillow, taped to the mirror. The messages were short, threatening, always ending with her name. "I'm closer than you think, Emma. You can't hide from me. I've been waiting. Always." She tried to tell Jason, but he dismissed them as pranks or her imagination. It's just stress. You're overthinking. Maybe you need some sleep." But sleep brought no relief. Every time she closed her eyes, the shadows seemed to creep closer, whispering her name in voices that were almost human, yet distorted, unnatural. One night, she awoke to a cold breath on her neck. Frozen with fear, she dared not move, listening as the whisper came again. "I can see you, watching you, always." Terrified, she flicked on the bedside lamp. Nothing. The room was empty, yet the oppressive feeling remained, pressing in from all sides. She realized with growing horror that she was no longer alone, not in the way humans are, but in a way that defied reason. Something had taken an interest in her, and it would not let go. Determined to fight back, Emma began researching the history of the apartment. She scoured old newspapers, local archives, and online forums, looking for any clue about the previous tenants. She discovered that the building had a dark past. Many residents had reported strange disappearances, whispers in the night, and the feeling of being watched. Some never returned. The apartment itself seemed to carry a curse, binding those who entered to an unseen force. The more Emma learned, the clearer it became. The entity in her apartment had been waiting for her, perhaps for years, feeding on fear, growing stronger with each passing day. She realized that leaving would not be enough. It would follow her, and there was no telling what it would do if she tried to escape. As Chapter 2 closed, Emma stood by the window, staring out at the mist-shrouded street. The shadows of the trees swayed in the wind, but she knew the darkness she feared most was inside her apartment, inside the walls, inside the corners of every room. And as she shivered in the cold October night, the whisper came again, louder and clearer than ever. "I'm right behind you, Emma. Always." The days after Emma's discovery of the apartment's dark history passed in a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. She found herself pacing from room to room, her eyes darting to every corner, every shadow, anticipating movement that never came. Or so she told herself. Jason, busy with work, barely noticed her increasing agitation, brushing off her nervous glances and jittery behavior as stress from the move. But Emma knew better. Something was here in the apartment, and it wasn't bound by the logic of the living. It started subtly. Objects moved, not just minor things. Whole pieces of furniture shifted while she slept. A chair she had placed against the wall one night would be in the center of the room the next morning. Doors she had bolted at night were found wide open. And then came the whispers, louder and more insistent than ever. "I'm closer, Emma. So close." Emma began recording the sounds at night, hoping to capture evidence, something Jason couldn't dismiss. But the recordings only captured static and faint whispering, distorted almost beyond recognition, like the voice had been stretched, warped, and amplified in the darkness one night. She woke to the sensation of someone, or something, sitting on the edge of her bed. Heart hammering. She froze, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe. Her gaze searched the darkness for the source, and then she saw it. A shadow, humanoid, taller than any human, its form wavering like smoke in a breeze. Its presence was suffocating, pressing against her chest, filling the room with an unnatural cold. "Leave me alone," she screamed, gripping the sheets. The shadow recoiled slightly, then tilted its head, as if considering her defiance. And then she heard it, not in whispers this time, but in a low, menacing voice that slithered into her mind. "You cannot leave. You belong to me." Terrified, Emma lunged for the bedside lamp, fumbling in the dark. Light spilled across the room and the shadow vanished, leaving only the oppressive chill in its place. She sat on the bed, trembling, unable to shake the feeling that it had never truly left. Over the next few days, Emma noticed new signs of the entity's power. She would see its reflection in mirrors, fleeting, blurred, almost human, but wrong in ways she couldn't describe. And every night the whispers grew louder, angrier. One evening, determined to confront the presence, she set up a small circle of candles in the living room, drawing on rituals she had read online about banishing spirits. She stood in the center, holding her hands out, repeating incantations she barely understood, hoping to force the entity to reveal itself. At first, nothing happened. Then the candles flickered violently, though there was no breeze. Shadows danced along the walls, stretching and coiling, forming shapes that seemed to move toward her. Emma's voice faltered as panic set in, and suddenly the room went cold, the temperature dropping far below normal. Her breath came in visible clouds, and the shadows on the walls thickened, merging into the form of the figure that haunted her. It spoke again, voice low and chilling. "I've waited, and now you see me." Emma stumbled backward, the candles tipping over and extinguishing. She scrambled for the doorway, but the hallway stretched farther than it should have, twisting impossibly, as if the apartment itself had warped around the entity. She could hear whispers coming from all directions calling her name, each one overlapping the other in a deafening chorus. In a moment of sheer terror, she bolted for the front door, but it wouldn't open. The handle twisted in her hand, refusing to budge. And then she felt it, cold fingers brushing her shoulder, its touch like ice sinking into her bones. She screamed, spinning around, but the room was empty. Yet the presence lingered, palpable and suffocating. She backed into the living room, pressing herself against the wall, trying to calm her racing heart. That's when she noticed it. The notes had multiplied. Hundreds of tiny scraps of paper covered the floor, all with her name written in jagged, frantic handwriting. "I'm closer. I'm here, always." Emma sank to the floor, clutching her head, her mind teetering on the edge of panic. She realized the entity wasn't just haunting her apartment. It was learning, adapting, and feeding off her fear. Every heartbeat, every shiver, every whispered prayer strengthened it. That night, she barely slept. Every sound, footsteps, scratching, soft breathing, kept her on edge. And in the small hours before dawn, she woke to the softest of sounds, the faint creak of a chair moving across the floor. Her eyes snapped open, and in the darkness, she saw a figure sitting in the corner of the living room. Its head was cocked, its form writhing like smoke. It spoke, voice a low hiss that seemed to echo in her skull. "You can't hide from me. You belong to me now, Emma. Emma's scream echoed through the empty apartment, a sound of pure terror and despair. She realized that running wouldn't save her. Locking herself in a room wouldn't help. The apartment had become a trap, and she was its prey. The entity had claimed her, and she was powerless to stop it. By morning, Jason returned home, finding Emma huddled in the corner, shaking violently, surrounded by the scattered notes. He tried to comfort her, but she couldn't speak. The words wouldn't come, and as he looked into her eyes, he noticed something chilling, a shadow moving behind her, reflected in the hallway mirror. Jason's hand went cold as he realized what she had been living with. Something in that apartment wasn't just a presence. It was a predator, patient, intelligent, and relentless. And it had chosen Emma. As Chapter 3 closes, the apartment seems to breathe with malevolence. The shadows coil and stretch, whispering her name, waiting for the night to come again. And Emma knows with a cold certainty that the terror has only just begun. The night had fallen like a shroud over the city, the wind howling through the streets and rattling the windows of the old apartment. Emma paced the living room, clutching a flashlight and a small journal filled with frantic notes about the entity that haunted her. Jason was gone, too overwhelmed and skeptical to believe her fully, leaving Emma alone with the oppressive presence that had grown stronger with each passing night. She had tried everything, locking doors, using candles, recording audio, even desperate prayers, but nothing had worked. The entity wasn't just haunting her, it was evolving, learning her fears, feeding on them, growing more tangible with every heartbeat. The whispering began again, low and deliberate, echoing from the corners of the apartment. Emma, come to me. Emma froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The shadows along the walls seemed to stretch, coiling like serpents, forming humanoid shapes that twisted in impossible ways. She realized that this was no longer a mere haunting. This was a hunt, determined to end it. Emma did what she had feared the most. She confronted the entity directly. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the center of the living room, holding the flashlight like a weapon. "I'm not afraid of you," she shouted, her voice shaking but defiant. "Leave me alone!" The shadows reacted instantly, recoiling and then swirling faster, forming a towering, featureless figure in the center of the room. Its presence pressed against her chest, suffocating and overwhelming, and she felt the icy fingers of fear wrap around her soul. "You cannot resist. You belong to me," it hissed, voice slithering into her mind, warping reality around her. Emma remembered something from her research. The only way to weaken it was to confront it, acknowledge it, and refuse to be consumed by fear. She closed her eyes, taking deep breaths, repeating a mantra to herself. "You have no power over me. I am not afraid. You are nothing." The shadows writhed violently, a low guttural sound emanating from the dark corners of the room, shaking the walls. But Emma stood firm. She opened her eyes, pointing the flashlight directly at the figure. The beam pierced the darkness, and for a moment, the entity faltered, its form flickering like a broken reflection. Emma's voice grew stronger, louder, filled with the determination she had not known she possessed. "I see you. You are nothing without me. You have no control here," the figure screeched, an unholy sound that shook the apartment to its core. Shadows tore themselves from the walls, twisting and convulsing before dissipating into nothingness. The cold that had gripped the apartment for weeks began to lift, replaced by the warmth of dawn creeping through the curtains. Emma collapsed onto the floor, shaking but alive. For the first time in weeks, the apartment was silent. The whispering had stopped. The shadows had retreated. She had faced the entity and, against all odds, survived. When Jason returned later that morning, he found Emma sitting on the couch, pale but smiling faintly. She explained what had happened, her voice steady, recounting the terrifying nights and the confrontation that had finally ended the entity's hold over her. Jason listened, disbelief fading into awe as he realized the depth of her ordeal. Over the next few weeks, Emma and Jason worked to cleanse the apartment completely, smudging, rearranging, and purifying the space. Emma began writing again, documenting every terrifying detail of her experience, determined to warn others about the darkness that sometimes hides in the most unassuming places. Yet, even as the apartment seemed calm, Emma knew the truth. Some entities do not leave entirely. Some linger, waiting for the moment fear returns, ready to feed again. But she also knew she was stronger now, that she had stared into the abyss and refused to be consumed. And in the quietest moments, when the wind blew just right, Emma would still hear a faint whisper, like a shadow brushing against the edge of her mind. "I'll be back." But Emma no longer trembled. She had faced the darkness, and for now, she had won. Sophie had always been drawn to antiques. There was something about the history behind them, the whispers of the past embedded in the wood, glass, and metal that called to her. So when she stumbled upon a small, dimly lit shop tucked away on a side street in Salem, Massachusetts, she felt an instant pull inside. Dusty shelves lined the walls, filled with trinkets, clocks, and furniture that seemed to carry the weight of decades, if not centuries. At the back of the shop, leaning against the wall, was a tall, ornate mirror. Its frame was carved with intricate patterns of ivy and roses, the wood darkened with age. Sophie felt an almost magnetic attraction. Something about the way the glass reflected the light made her heart skip. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with piercing gray eyes, watched her silently. "That one," the woman said softly. "It's special. Not all mirrors are what they seem." Sophie smiled politely, assuming it was just a sales tactic. "It's beautiful. How much?" The woman's eyes darkened for a moment. "It comes with a price beyond money. Be certain you want it." Sophie, ignoring the cryptic warning, purchased the mirror and brought it home. She placed it in her bedroom, against the wall opposite her bed. That night, she stared into its glass, admiring the way it reflected the warm glow of her lamps. But as she gazed longer, she noticed something odd. The reflection seemed delayed. When she moved her hand quickly, the mirror's image lingered a fraction of a second behind, almost as if it were living on its own rhythm. She shook her head, attributing it to fatigue. But when she turned off the lights and lay in bed, staring into the darkness, the mirror's surface seemed to shimmer like ripples in water. And then, faintly, a voice whispered her name, "Sophie." Her heart jumped, and she sat upright, the blanket clutched around her shoulders. The room was empty. Only the mirror stood, reflecting her terrified face. Over the next few days, Sophie became increasingly aware that the mirror was not just reflecting her. It was observing her. Movements in the reflection were slightly off. Sometimes it smiled when she didn't. Sometimes it lingered, staring long after she had looked away. She began keeping a journal, noting every discrepancy, every strange occurrence. Her boyfriend, Liam, noticed the growing tension in her demeanor. "Are you okay?" he asked one evening, entering her bedroom to find her pacing in front of the mirror. I think this mirror is wrong," she confessed. "I see things in it, movements that aren't mine, faces that aren't mine." Liam laughed nervously. "It's a mirror, Sophie. Maybe you're just stressed. It's probably the lighting or your imagination." But Sophie knew better. That night, as she lay in bed, she saw something impossible. In the reflection of the mirror, a dark figure emerged behind her, tall, faceless, and watching. Her body froze, terror rooting her to the mattress. When she turned, there was nothing. The mirror, however, continued to show the figure inching closer, its presence suffocating and cold. Terrified, she tried covering the mirror, draping a blanket over it, but the figure still appeared in the edges, peeking out, relentless. Every night it grew bolder, moving closer in the reflection, whispering her name, calling her toward it. By the end of the week, Sophie realized the horrifying truth. The mirror was a gateway, and something was trying to reach her from the other side. The figure had learned her routine, anticipating her movements, appearing in moments when she felt safest, when she least expected it. And every time she looked away, it seemed to grow stronger, feeding on her fear. The whispers became insistent, almost pleading. Come. Come closer, join me. Sophie couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. The presence consumed her thoughts, her energy, until she felt she was losing herself to the reflection. Desperate, she began researching the mirror, tracing its origins. She learned it had belonged to a wealthy occultist in the 1800s, rumored to have trapped souls in mirrors to harness their fear and energy. Many of the previous owners had vanished mysteriously, leaving behind only tales of whispers in the night and shadows that moved with intent. Her journal filled with warnings, but the presence continued to tighten its grip. That night, she sat in front of the mirror, flashlight in hand, her reflection trembling as the figure appeared closer than ever. Sophie, I've been waiting for you, it hissed. Panic surged, but Sophie forced herself to speak aloud, her voice shaking yet resolute. I will not go with you. I am not afraid. The mirror quivered, the figure's outline flickering. And in that moment, Sophie realized that the only way to fight it was to face it directly, to refuse its power over her. But even as she stood, heart racing, she knew that confronting the figure would be the most terrifying ordeal of her life. The days following Sophie's initial terrifying encounter with the mirror passed in a haze of anxiety and sleepless nights. Every glance at the glass made her heart pound. Every flicker of movement within its surface felt like a threat. Sophie began avoiding it entirely, covering it with sheets and moving furniture in front of it, hoping to ignore the presence that had taken root in her life. But avoidance proved useless. Each night when the apartment fell silent, she would hear the faint whispers emanating from the mirror, soft, insistent, and impossibly close. Sophie. Closer, closer. One evening, Liam noticed the change in her demeanor. Sophie was pale, jumpy, and withdrawn, flinching at shadows and murmurs that he could not hear. You need to relax, he said, attempting to comfort her. It's just a mirror. You're letting stress get to you. It's not stress, Liam. There's something in the mirror. I've seen it. It moves when I don't. It watches me, Sophie insisted, her voice trembling. Liam tried to soothe her, brushing off her words as paranoia. Yet he couldn't ignore the cold air that seemed to gather around the bedroom when Sophie approached the covered mirror. Even he could feel the oppressive weight, the almost tangible pressure pressing against his chest. That night, after Liam had gone to sleep, Sophie sat alone in the living room, flashlight in hand, staring at the draped mirror. Her mind raced as she recalled the stories of past owners, souls trapped and consumed by the malevolent presence. She knew she couldn't continue to live like this, paralyzed by fear, but confronting it felt like stepping into a nightmare without end. Summoning every ounce of courage, Sophie pulled the sheet away. The mirror gleamed in the dim light, and for a brief, terrifying moment, it was just a mirror. And then the reflection shifted. The figure emerged, tall and faceless, rising slowly from the surface of the glass, as if it were stepping out of another world. Its presence was suffocating, the temperature around her plummeting, her breath forming icy clouds in the air. I've waited for you, it whispered, voice dripping with malice. Sophie's legs trembled, but she refused to retreat. She gripped the flashlight tightly, shining it at the figure. Shadows twisted violently as if the light hurt it, but it only hesitated briefly before advancing. She remembered her research. The only way to resist the entity was to confront it, refusing to succumb to fear. Her voice, though quivering, grew firm. "I am not yours. You have no power over me." The figure recoiled, its form flickering like a broken reflection. Then it hissed, a sound that made the glass itself vibrate. The apartment seemed to warp around her. Walls stretched and twisted in unnatural ways. Shadows writhed along the floor, ceiling, and walls. The entity's whispers grew louder, overlapping, chaotic, demanding. Sophie's heart raced and sweat dripped from her forehead as the figure lunged from the mirror. Yet it stopped just short of her, as if respecting her defiance. "You resist. But resistance will cost you," it hissed. The mirror began to crack, fine lines spiderwebbing across the glass. Sophie stumbled backward, barely catching herself on the couch. She could feel the entity trying to pull her in, to drag her into the reflection, to consume her essence. Panic clawed at her chest, but she forced herself to breathe, grounding her thoughts. "You are nothing without me," Sophie shouted, remembering a passage from an old occult text she had read. "I am my own master. You cannot control me." The cracks on the mirror spread faster, spiderwebbing across the surface, reflecting a kaleidoscope of shadows and distorted images. The figure screamed, a piercing, otherworldly wail that shook the apartment, and then, for the first time, it faltered. Its form flickered, unstable, writhing as if in pain. Sophie realized she had found its weakness. Fear gave it strength, but defiance weakened it. Gathering her courage, she advanced toward the mirror, shining the flashlight directly at the figure and reciting aloud every affirmation of her independence. Her will, her refusal to be consumed. The figure writhed violently, the glass shaking and cracking further. Then, with a final ear-splitting scream, it dissolved into a mist, sucked back into the broken mirror, which now hung shattered and jagged, its surface darkened and lifeless. Silence fell. The oppressive chill lifted, leaving the apartment warm and quiet for the first time in weeks. Sophie sank to the floor, exhausted, trembling, but alive. She knew the entity was not destroyed entirely. It had retreated, but she had survived. She wrapped the broken mirror in a thick blanket, sealing it and placing it in a corner, far from her sight. By morning, Liam returned, noticing the fear and fatigue etched into her face. She recounted the encounter, explaining how she had confronted the entity and forced it back into the mirror. Though skeptical, he noticed the deep fear that lingered in her eyes and could no longer dismiss her experience entirely. Over the next few weeks, Sophie took measures to purify her apartment, ensuring no remnants of the entity's influence remained. She researched protections, wards, and rituals, refusing to take the risk of another encounter lightly. Though the mirror still sat in the corner, now covered and silent, Sophie knew that some horrors never truly leave. They only wait for the right moment. Yet for the first time since the mirror's arrival, she felt a glimmer of hope. She had faced the darkness, stared into the reflection, and emerged unbroken. And though the entity may linger, Sophie had proven to herself that fear alone did not control her, and perhaps that was enough to keep it at bay. For now, Sophie had barely slept the past week. Every creak of the apartment, every flicker of a shadow sent her heart racing. Even with the broken mirror covered, she could feel its presence lurking just beyond the edges of her vision, like smoke curling into corners, suffocating yet unseen. The entity had retreated, but retreat was not defeat. It was only biding its time. That night, Liam had stayed late at work, leaving Sophie alone in the dimly lit apartment. She paced the living room, clutching her journal and a small vial of salt she had sprinkled around the apartment in a desperate attempt at protection. Every step she took seemed to echo unnaturally. The sound amplified as if the apartment itself had become alive, watching, waiting. And then came the whispers, soft at first, almost hesitant like a predator testing its prey. "Sophie, so close, come to me." Her stomach dropped. She could feel it, the icy touch of the entity creeping closer, coiling through the room like a serpent. The broken mirror in the corner seemed to pulse faintly beneath its covering, as if it still held a tether to the creature trapped inside. Determined not to succumb, Sophie took a deep breath and stepped closer, uncovering the jagged glass. The shards reflected the dim light of her flashlight, casting fractured shadows that danced along the walls. And then she saw it, a face pale and featureless, staring at her from the broken shards. "You cannot resist me," it hissed, voice echoing in her mind. Fear surged, but Sophie planted her feet, gripping the flashlight tightly. "I am not yours." "I will not be consumed," she shouted. The entity erupted from the shards, coalescing into a towering dark figure that moved with impossible speed. Its form seemed to ripple like liquid shadow, stretching and contorting, reaching toward her with arms that dissolved into mist at the tips. Sophie stumbled backward, scattering the protective salt in panic. The creature hissed in fury, its whispers rising into a deafening roar that filled the room. "Your fear feeds me. Your terror sustains me!" Sophie screamed, swinging the flashlight at the entity. For a moment, light seemed to burn its edges, but it recoiled only slightly, then surged forward again. The apartment walls warped around her, elongating and bending, creating an impossible labyrinth of shadows. Sophie realized with mounting horror that the entity could manipulate reality within the apartment, twisting space itself to trap her. Desperate, she recalled the incantations she had learned while researching protective rituals. With shaking hands, she drew a circle of salt around herself and shouted the words aloud, forcing the entity to pause. Its face twisted in anger, smoke-like tendrils lashing against the invisible barrier. "You cannot bind me forever," it screamed. Sophie's mind raced. She needed more than salt and words. She needed to confront the entity's essence, to force it back into the mirror completely. But approaching the shards meant exposing herself to the creature directly. Heart hammering, she took a step, then another, until she stood inches from the fractured glass. The figure lunged, and Sophie felt the icy brush of its touch on her arm. Cold, paralyzing fear surged, but she forced herself to speak, to resist. "I am not afraid." "You have no power over me." The shards began to glow faintly, pulsing with energy. Sophie concentrated, visualizing the entity being drawn back into the mirror, forced to submit. The creature screamed, a sound that rattled the apartment like breaking glass, its form writhing violently. "No, you cannot do this. You are mine!" Sophie's voice grew louder, filled with unshakable resolve. "I am my own master. Begone!" In an explosive surge of light, the entity was sucked into the shards, which shattered further under the force of its retreat. The room fell silent. The oppressive chill lifted instantly, replaced by the warmth of early dawn creeping through the curtains. Sophie sank to the floor, trembling, her heart racing, yet alive. The apartment was finally quiet. The mirror, now broken and lifeless, reflected only Sophie's exhausted, pale face. She knew the entity was gone, at least for now, but the memory of its presence lingered like a shadow across her mind. Liam returned shortly after, finding her curled on the floor amidst scattered salt and shattered glass. She recounted the confrontation, and this time he could see the raw terror in her eyes, the deep mark left by the supernatural ordeal. He helped her up, wrapping her in a blanket, and together they cleared the room, sealing the broken shards in a heavy box and placing it far from their living space. Sophie realized something crucial that night. The entity's power was fueled by fear, and by refusing to be afraid, she had weakened it. But she also knew that it could return, that some darkness never truly dies. It only waits for the perfect opportunity to strike again. Though exhausted, Sophie felt a spark of triumph. She had faced the darkness, stared into the reflection, and survived. And in that fragile victory, she found the courage to reclaim her apartment, her life, and her sense of safety. At least for now. The apartment was quiet now, but Sophie knew that silence was fragile. Every shadow seemed a little too dark, every creak of the floor a little too deliberate. She had survived the entity's attack the night before, forcing it back into the shattered mirror shards. But she understood the truth. It wasn't gone. Not completely. Some part of it lingered, patient, waiting for another moment of fear to regain strength. That morning, Sophie began cleaning, carefully collecting the broken shards of the mirror. Each fragment reflected her pale, exhausted face. But she noticed something she hadn't before, a faint, shifting darkness behind the glass. The entity hadn't fully retreated. It was trapped, yes, but its will seeped through the cracks, whispering promises of fear, malice, and a future encounter. Liam arrived home, noticing her pale, haggard appearance. Sophie explained everything, from the whispers to the attacks to the final confrontation. He listened intently, no longer skeptical, realizing that the terror Sophie had endured was real and beyond normal comprehension. Together, they devised a plan to seal the shards permanently. They took the mirror fragments to the basement, wrapping them in thick cloths, placing them in a wooden chest reinforced with iron. Sophie read aloud protective incantations she had researched, chanting words meant to contain spiritual energy and prevent malevolent entities from escaping. Each word carried weight, her voice trembling but determined. As she finished, a sudden cold wind surged through the basement, extinguishing the lights. The shadows deepened unnaturally, writhing along the walls, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. "You cannot hide. I will return always." The chest shook violently, rattling across the floor. Sophie's heart pounded as she held Liam's hand for support. The entity was attempting one last strike, trying to escape confinement. Its voice echoed through the basement, a chilling chorus of malice. "I am eternal. Your fear is mine. You cannot defeat me." But Sophie did not falter. She focused on her intent, visualizing the entity trapped forever, powerless to reach her. She repeated the incantations, louder and stronger, pouring all her courage, all her defiance into her voice. The chest trembled once more, then stopped. The whispers faded, leaving only the faintest echo of its malice. The air warmed, shadows retreated, and a sense of calm filled the basement for the first time in weeks. Sophie exhaled, relief washing over her. Over the next few days, she and Liam ensured the chest was securely sealed and placed in a storage room far from the apartment. They reinforced it with locks, iron, and protective wards, leaving it untouched. Sophie knew she had survived the ordeal, but the lesson remained. Evil, even when bound, is patient, intelligent, and relentless. Fear gives it life. Courage takes it away. Sophie returned to her normal routines gradually. She slept better, ate regularly, and regained the strength that the entity had drained from her. Yet, every so often, when the sunlight hit the shards just right or the wind whispered through the apartment, she felt the faintest trace of presence. A reminder that some darkness never truly disappears. It waits. Months later, Sophie began writing again, documenting her experiences with the mirror, the entity, and the terrifying power of fear. She published her account anonymously online, warning others of the mirror's history and the malevolent force it contained. People dismissed it as fiction, but Sophie knew the truth. The entity was real, patient, and eternal. And though she now slept with the lights on, and Liam always stayed close, she could not ignore the subtle warning she felt in her bones. Somewhere trapped behind shards of glass, the entity lingered, waiting for the moment fear returned to the world. And when it did, it would strike again. But Sophie was ready. She had faced it, stared into the reflection, and survived. And in that knowledge, she found a fragile but unbreakable strength. The mirror is broken. The reflection is gone, but the darkness waits. Claire had always loved the charm of older buildings. The way history seemed to seep into the walls, the smell of aged wood and plaster, the sense that stories lingered where people once lived. So, when she and her boyfriend Daniel found a small apartment in an early 1900s brownstone in downtown Chicago, she was thrilled. The building was quiet, quaint, and had that undeniable aura of character she adored. The first few days were idyllic. Claire and Daniel unpacked boxes, arranged furniture, and explored the neighborhood. But soon subtle oddities began to unsettle Claire. At first it was small things. The faint creak of floorboards when no one was walking, the occasional cold draft that seemed to come from nowhere, or the feeling of being watched while she moved about the apartment. One evening, as Claire unpacked the kitchen, she heard a faint whisper, a soft, almost indecipherable voice that called her name, Claire. She froze, listening. The apartment was empty, Daniel having stepped out to grab groceries. Shaking her head, she dismissed it as imagination, the result of tired nerves. Yet the whisper returned that night, stronger, more insistent. Claire, come here. Claire's pulse quickened. She searched the apartment, every corner in shadow, but found nothing. The air felt heavier, charged, as though the very walls were holding their breath. She tried to tell herself it was just stress from the move, but deep down, she knew it was something else, something alive within the apartment. Over the next few days, the whispers became more frequent. They were no longer confined to the evenings. Claire heard them while cooking, cleaning, even showering. The voice seemed to echo from the walls, soft but insistent, always calling her by name, always beckoning. Daniel noticed her growing unease. "You're imagining things," he said, trying to reassure her. "Old buildings make noises, that's all. Maybe you're just tired." Claire wanted to believe him, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. Objects shifted when she wasn't looking. Books fallen from shelves, cups on the counter moved, and even furniture slightly rearranged. The most disturbing occurrences were the whispers, now accompanied by fleeting shadows in her peripheral vision. They moved against the natural flow of light, slipping along walls, lingering just out of focus. One night, Claire awoke to a chilling sensation. Her bed felt icy cold, and the whispers surrounded her, louder than ever. "Claire, you're mine." She bolted upright, heart racing. The shadows in the room stretched unnaturally, twisting toward her, and she realized the apartment itself seemed to pulse with malevolence. Panicked, she grabbed her phone to call Daniel, but there was no signal. The apartment felt isolated, removed from the safety of the outside world. Determined to fight back, Claire tried reasoning with whatever haunted the apartment. "I am not yours," she shouted, her voice trembling. "You cannot have me." The whispers paused, then resumed, now angrier, more forceful. "You can't leave. You belong to me." Claire's fear escalated as the night progressed. She could feel a presence in the room, circling, watching. It was not human, not alive in any normal sense, yet its intelligence was palpable. The shadows twisted and coiled around furniture, creeping closer, always maintaining a distance that tormented her mind. The following day, she began researching the building's history. Local records revealed a chilling past. Several tenants had vanished mysteriously over the past century, all in apartments on the same floor. No bodies were found, and rumors of strange sounds and ghostly sightings persisted in old newspapers and city archives. The very walls of the building seemed to retain the memory of the lost souls, whispering their torment to the living. That night, alone while Daniel worked late, the apartment erupted with activity. Doors slammed, windows rattled, and the whispers became a deafening chorus, overlapping and insistent. Claire tried to stay grounded, repeating to herself that she would not give in to fear, but the presence pressed against her like a physical weight, cold and suffocating. She realized she could not stay passive. Something had chosen her, taken an interest in her presence, and she would have to confront it or risk losing herself completely. Summoning every ounce of courage, she prepared herself for the first real confrontation with the entity that lurked in her apartment. "I will not belong to you," she whispered to the shadows, determination replacing her fear. The apartment seemed to respond, the temperature dropping even further. Shadows twisting into near-human shapes, the whispers rising in intensity, as if the building itself had awoken to the fight. Claire knew then that this was only the beginning of a long, terrifying ordeal, and survival would depend on her ability to face what lived in the darkness. Claire's anxiety had escalated over the past few nights. The whispers in the apartment were relentless, no longer confined to soft, subtle murmurs. They now filled her every waking moment. The voice was insistent, demanding, as if the walls themselves had become sentient. "Claire, you're mine. Come to me." Objects moved of their own accord. Books fell from shelves without cause, lamps swayed even without a breeze, and doors that she had locked were found wide open. The apartment no longer felt like a home. It had become a labyrinth of shadows and malice, designed to instill fear at every corner. Daniel noticed the change in her. "You need to rest," he said one evening, concern etched across his face. "It's just stress. Maybe the old building is playing tricks on you." Claire shook her head, voice trembling. "It's not the building, Daniel. It's something else. Something alive, and it's here, watching me." Daniel tried to dismiss her words, but even he could feel it, the oppressive weight in the air, a chill that had nothing to do with the season, pressing down in every corner of the apartment. That night, when he went to bed early, Claire was left alone with the shadows. The whispers grew louder, more demanding. "Come, you belong to me. You cannot leave." Claire paced, clutching a small vial of salt and a flashlight, trying desperately to protect herself. She tried reasoning with the entity, speaking aloud to assert control. "I will not belong to you. You have no power over me." The apartment responded immediately. Shadows writhed along the walls, stretching unnaturally, coiling like snakes, and objects were thrown across the room. Claire's heart pounded, and sweat poured down her face as the temperature dropped suddenly, freezing the breath in her lungs. It wasn't merely a haunting. The entity had learned, grown stronger by feeding on her fear. It stalked her movements, anticipating her responses, appearing in ways that defied reality, always at the periphery, always close enough to terrify but not touch. That night, Claire decided she could no longer be passive. She began researching rituals and protective measures, determined to confront the malevolent presence rather than be consumed by it. Candles were set in circles, protective symbols drawn, and salt carefully sprinkled along the perimeter of rooms. But the entity was clever, and it adapted to every precaution. The whispers intensified as she prepared, now a chorus of overlapping voices, some desperate, some angry, some mocking. "You cannot escape. I am everywhere. You belong to me." Claire felt the walls of the apartment shift subtly, as if alive. Shadows stretched toward her from corners she hadn't noticed before, forming distorted humanoid shapes. The whispering reached a crescendo, and the temperature plummeted further, making her teeth chatter and her limbs stiff. Determined, she centered herself, repeating affirmations she had learned in her research. "You have no power over me. I am my own master. I am not afraid." As if in response, the shadows recoiled slightly, but only momentarily. The entity was testing her, measuring her resolve, probing for weakness. Claire knew she had to maintain her courage, or she would be lost to the apartment forever. Suddenly, a cold hand seemed to brush her shoulder. She spun around, heart hammering, but the room was empty. The whispers grew louder, angrier. "Do not resist. You cannot survive. I am eternal." Claire realized the horrifying truth. This entity had existed for decades, preying on residents, feeding on fear, and growing stronger with every soul it touched. Its patience was infinite, and it had chosen her as its next prey. With trembling hands, she focused on the candlelit circle she had prepared, drawing herself into the protective space. She recited every chant, every invocation she could remember, visualizing the entity's power being repelled, contained. Shadows writhed violently, objects clattering against walls, and the temperature swung wildly, but Claire refused to break. By dawn, the apartment settled. The shadows withdrew slightly, the whispers softened, and the oppressive weight lifted temporarily. Claire sank to the floor, exhausted, realizing that survival meant constant vigilance, that the apartment would never be completely safe. She understood something crucial. The entity thrived on fear, but courage weakened it. Her resolve, though battered, had kept her alive. Yet the whispering was a constant reminder. The apartment was alive, patient, and it had not given up. Claire knew she had to prepare for the next confrontation. The entity was watching, learning, and waiting for another opportunity to strike, and she would need every ounce of strength and courage to survive it. The apartment had become a prison. Every corner, every shadow, every whisper reminded Claire that she was being hunted. The entity had grown bolder, more aggressive, feeding on her anxiety, learning her routines, and striking when she least expected it. The air was heavy with malevolence, and even Daniel, who stayed late most nights at work, began to notice a chill that had nothing to do with the season. It started with small, deliberate movements, cups sliding across counters, books tumbling off shelves, shadows flickering at the edge of her vision. But soon the entity escalated. One night, as Claire tried to sleep, she awoke to a whisper that was sharper, louder, almost a command. "Come to me. You cannot hide." The room was icy, and she could feel the presence circling her bed. She tried to sit up, but the shadows thickened, pressing against her, immobilizing her. The whispers became a deafening chorus, overlapping voices calling her name, chanting promises of fear and torment. Desperate, Claire grabbed the vial of salt she had been keeping for protection and sprinkled it across the room. The shadows recoiled slightly, hissing in protest, but the entity was relentless. It surged toward her in a twisting, amorphous form, smoke-like limbs reaching for her, as if it could pull her into its darkness. Claire screamed, swinging her flashlight wildly. The beam cut through the shadows, making the entity writhe violently, but it did not retreat. She realized it was not merely a haunting. It was intelligent, adapting to her movements, attacking with precision. "Your fear strengthens me. Your terror sustains me," it hissed, voice echoing from every corner of the apartment. She backed into the protective circle she had drawn with salt and candles, chanting the incantations she had researched. The entity recoiled momentarily, its voice twisting into a shriek of fury, rattling the walls and making the windows vibrate. Claire's heart pounded, her lungs burning as she continued to recite the chants, visualizing the entity being repelled, driven back into nothingness. The shadows writhed, forming grotesque shapes that lunged toward her, yet the protective circle held, though barely. Suddenly, a cold, invisible force slammed her against the wall. Pain shot through her shoulder, and for a moment she was paralyzed with fear. The whispers surged, chanting, mocking, promising destruction. "You cannot resist. I am eternal. You are mine." Summoning every ounce of courage, Claire stood tall, her voice shaking but resolute. "I will not belong to you. You have no power over me." The shadows convulsed, the entity shrieking, twisting violently in its form. The candles flickered wildly, and the salt circle glowed faintly as if infused with energy from her defiance. The entity surged one last time, attempting to break through the protective barrier. Claire focused, visualizing it retreating, shrinking, losing its hold over her with a final, ear-piercing scream. The entity dissolved into the walls, the shadows dissipating, and the apartment fell silent. The temperature returned to normal, and the oppressive weight lifted, leaving Claire trembling but alive. Exhausted, she sank to the floor, clutching the flashlight. She knew the entity had retreated, but it was not gone. It would return if she ever showed fear again. Her survival depended on constant vigilance and courage. By morning, Daniel returned to find her exhausted but alive. Claire recounted the terrifying ordeal, and he finally believed her. Together, they reinforced the apartment with protective measures, wards, and salt, determined to reclaim their home. Claire realized that the entity thrived on fear, but courage weakened it. She had survived, but she knew the whispers would never truly disappear. The apartment was alive, patient, and relentless, and she would need every ounce of strength to face it again if it returned. The apartment was quiet, or at least quieter than it had been in weeks. Claire had fortified every corner with salt, candles, and protective symbols she had painstakingly drawn. Daniel stayed close, a comforting presence, though even he could feel the lingering chill that whispered through the old building. But Claire knew the silence was temporary. The entity had not been destroyed. It had only retreated, biding its time, growing stronger, waiting for the slightest crack in her resolve. Every shadow seemed alive, every corner a potential threat. She could feel it, patient, intelligent, watching her, always testing. Determined to end the nightmare, Claire decided on a final confrontation. She cleared the living room, arranging candles in a large circle, drawing protective sigils along the floor. She carefully placed the salt, reciting incantations she had studied, her voice steady and commanding. The apartment seemed to respond, the air growing heavier, charged with anticipation. "Claire, you cannot escape. You are mine." The whispers hissed, louder than ever, echoing from every corner of the room. Claire stood in the center of the circle, flashlight in one hand, her journal of notes and spells in the other. She took a deep breath, centering herself. Fear would only feed the entity. Courage was her weapon. The shadows coalesced, forming a dark, towering figure that moved with impossible speed. It lunged from every direction, a torrent of smoke-like limbs and twisting darkness. Claire's heart pounded, but she held her ground, chanting louder, visualizing the entity being confined, forced to retreat permanently. "I am my own master. You have no power over me," she shouted. The figure shrieked a sound that made the walls tremble, the candles flicker violently. It surged toward her, trying to break the protective circle, but the sigils held. The salt glowed faintly, infused with the strength of her resolve. The shadows writhed, screaming in fury, yet they could not penetrate the barrier she had created. With a final surge of effort, Claire focused on the entity's core, visualizing it shrinking, compressing, returning to the shadows from which it had emerged. The room shook, objects rattled, and the temperature swung wildly. And then, with a deafening, otherworldly scream, the figure imploded into itself, dissipating into nothingness. The apartment fell silent. The chill lifted, shadows receded, and the oppressive weight vanished. Claire sank to the floor, exhausted, trembling, but alive. She had confronted the darkness and prevailed. Over the next few days, she and Daniel fortified the apartment further, cleansing it with salt, protective symbols, and rituals. The whispers had stopped, though Claire knew they might return if she ever faltered in courage. She had learned a vital truth. The entity thrived on fear, but courage was its weakness. Claire resumed her life cautiously, always vigilant, but with a newfound strength. She documented her experiences, determined to warn others about the building's dark history, the entity that lingered in its walls, and the terrifying patience of forces beyond comprehension. Though the apartment was calm, Claire could never forget the sensation of being watched, the way the shadows had moved with intent, the whispers that had clawed at her sanity. The entity was a patient predator, and some darkness never truly dies. It waits, biding its time for the next moment of weakness. But Claire had survived. She had faced the whispering shadows, stared into the darkness, and emerged unbroken. And in that survival, she found strength. A fragile, hard-won assurance that courage, even in the face of relentless evil, could triumph. The whispers are silent, for now, but the darkness waits.